like an immense coffin, the train trundled through the long summer afternoon. 1 million Americans lined the tracks, all hoping to catch a glimpse of his casket as Robert Francis Kennedy was taken for burial in Washington. The poor, the despairing, the devout, widows whose husbands had died in Vietnam, blacks whose ghettos still smoldered, and the young, their dream broken far too soon. Arlington National Cemetery. The two brothers are reunited, killed just 5 years apart. On November 22, 1963, in Dallas, President John F. Kennedy's death had ended American innocence. With his passing, it seemed America had plunged into unending violence and social turmoil. As Bobby Kennedy buried his brother, he was consumed by remorse and guilt. And as he reflected on the political life he had shared with John, the question arose, who had killed his brother and why? There had been so many enemies, filled with hate and with good reason for revenge. The mob, J. Edgar Hoover, Fidel Castro, Jimmy Hoffa, even Southern racists. Bobby had made bitter foes of them all. In January 1964, Lee Harvey Oswald's widow, Marina, testified before the Warren Commission, the investigation into JFK's assassination. Oswald had been killed by a hitman linked to the mob before he was able to confess about his actions in Dallas. Bobby did not believe the headlines. Oswald, he thought, had been the front man in a broader conspiracy. Also in 1964, Senator Warren delivered his report to President Lyndon Johnson, John Kennedy's successor at the White House. Bob Kennedy did not testify before the commission, nor did he question its verdict in public that Oswald had acted alone. To have done so would have meant confronting terrible truths about his role in his brother's presidency, and about the consuming passions at the core of his personality. The day the Warren report was delivered, Bobby took a break from campaigning in the state of New York to be alone. He was now haunted by the years he had devoted to his dead brother, and as he ran for office in his own right, he was finally forced to reflect on what he had done. What was it deep inside him that had created such furies and culminated in his brother's loss? Before he could escape his brother's shadow, he needed to learn from his past. Where had he gone wrong? Was it Jimmy Hoffa?
There might be some question about Mr. Bridges. There is absolutely no question about Mr. Goldblatt. And evidently you agree.
Hoffa had been his first moral crusade, a fitting opponent in his first great public fight. But had Bobby pursued Hoffa too relentlessly?
On the basis what is good for the American worker, the American citizen.
Or otherwise you wouldn't have said, don't put me in their class.
Don't you put me in a class that they're tagged. That's what I said. And I say tagged. But I want to have, if you will, sir, the record clear that there are no aspersions on me being associated with, controlled, or any part of the Communist Party in America.
Back in the late 1950s, truck drivers across America belonged to Teamsters Union. Many of its officials were linked to the mob. Hoffa was the union's leader. The battle against Hoffa had begun a pattern. By attacking perceived evil, he had found acceptance within his family and approval for being the toughest Kennedy, the son his father had intended him to be. Hoffa had been arrested but released because of lack of evidence. Bobby had then been determined to somehow put him behind bars.
Hoffa was arrested tonight at about midnight. We just had an arraignment before the United States Commissioner here. I asked for an immediate hearing on behalf of Mr. Hoffa so that we could air these charges publicly right away, but the government asked for a 2-week continuance.
But it had not just been his fight. His brother had also become famous for going after mobsters and corrupt union officials, while they had worked together on the Rackets Committee.
I would be very happy to have our legal counsel here to acquaint the American people with the fact that this is a strike-breaking, union-busting bill, in my opinion.
Mr. Hoffa, this bill is not a strike-breaking, union-busting bill. You're the best argument I know for it. Your testimony here this afternoon, your complete indifference to the fact that people who hold responsible positions in your union come before this committee, I think makes this bill essential.
Moving in on Jimmy Hoffa meant that the Kennedy brothers had taken on organized crime, and the mob would not forget.
Kennedy is a liar. And there is no foundation of fact for either his statement in the McClellan Committee hearings, and I say that he deliberately used the prestige of the United States Senate to be able to enrich himself in publicizing his name.
On reflection, Bobby could see that he had gone too far with Hoffa. He had been trying to prove himself as a Kennedy tough guy. From the very start, his role had been clear. He would be the ruthless operator who would devote his life to realizing his father's dream, making his older brother John President of the United States, whatever the cost.
Well, I guess you're glad it's over, aren't you, Bobby?
I am, Jack.
Okay.
In 1952, his father had ordered Bobby to be the uncompromising hidden operator who would organize John's campaign for a Senate seat. The 1956 Democratic Convention. John, the rising young star of American politics. Bobby, the Kennedy behind his self-assured brother, handled the press and top party officials. He would now sacrifice his own ambition to win his brother the ultimate political power. The coal mines of West Virginia, the most crucial primary in John Kennedy's bid to win the Democratic nomination in 1960 to become President of the United States. Despite his upbringing as a billionaire's son, Bobby had laid the foundation for his brother's success by winning over working-class Americans with his sincerity and humor, and by destroying all who dared get in his way. Thanks to Bobby, John F. Kennedy had arrived at the summer 1960 convention among the favorites.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that
Behind the scenes, Bobby had fought ruthlessly to ensure his brother's nomination, bullying, threatening, making politics his battleground. But there had been a sour note. Lyndon B. Johnson, whom Bobby loathed, had been selected to run as vice president. His appeal to Southern white Democrats had been crucial, and so he had stayed on the ticket.
Great appreciation to my brother Bobby, who has directed all our primary campaigns and the organization in all of them, as he did in my campaign for the Senate in 1952, and of course he has been the most essential figure.
Election Day, 1960. The glamorous Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline easily eclipsed the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon. Meanwhile, Bobby had fought harder and harder behind the scenes. He had now become totally obsessed by the quest to win ultimate power and prestige for his Boston Irish family. At the Kennedy compound in Cape Cod, the family had gathered to watch and pray. This time, Bobby had realized only too well every dirty trick and bought vote would count. But did he know that John won Chicago thanks to the intervention of the mob? Did he know of his father's ambiguous relations with the mafia? John's victory had been the narrowest in history. A new day and the dawn of a new era. Camelot, a period of mythical youth and glamour, when a new generation would forge the so-called new frontier. Bob had succeeded brilliantly, but as the hidden Kennedy, not the public victor like his brother. Deep inside, he later realized he had still felt unfulfilled. After months of relentless campaigning all over the country, had victory come at the price of rigged elections? This was not what he had hoped for. When John offered him the position of Attorney General, he refused. He needed to prove himself in his own right, as more than simply his brother's shadow. Bob was 26 when he married Ethel Shackle, a devout Catholic like the Kennedys. They had 11 children, and as Ethel's husband, he enjoyed great happiness. But in his public life, his destiny had never been his to determine, until his brother died. Bob would give in once again to his father's wishes.
I understand and realize the great problems and difficulties that will be facing all of us in that position. But I am familiar with the challenges from the work that I did in the Justice Department and later as Chief Counsel for the Senate Racket Committee. I know the great problems that face all of us as American citizens in this country. But I think a great deal can be done in this area and in many other areas.
It had begun so promisingly, with Bobby becoming the most powerful law enforcer in America, Attorney General perfectly placed to continue to protect his brother. But had the sudden bestowal of enormous power corrupted him so much that he had used it recklessly? First, he took the powerful director of the FBI to task for devoting more of his time and energy to pursuing a handful of communists than to going after organized crime.
This is Robert Pierpoint. There is the U.S. Department of Justice. You may be able to see lights burning in the 5th floor office of Attorney General Robert Kennedy. The Attorney General seldom leaves the office before 8 o'clock at night. Sometimes he and his assistants work until midnight or later. They are, for instance, pushing civil rights for a campaign against organized crime. All of this means homework. Somewhat unhappy wives complain that not only have they lost their husbands' evenings and weekends, even when the husbands are home, they bring the office with them. But that today seems to be the symbol of the vigor of the Kennedy administration.
Had he gone too far, too fast, blinded by his naive hatred of corrupt men and their allies, the mob?
We in the Department of Justice have become increasingly concerned about organized crime. It has become so rich and so powerful and so well entrenched that it has often become beyond the reach of law. We know that federal and local law enforcement officers have been most effective against narcotics, auto theft, prostitution, bank robberies, kidnapping, and other crimes. I ask you to join Mr. Hoover and me in strengthening law enforcement in this country, in preserving its vigor and its vitality.
He had underestimated J. Edgar Hoover, who had wanted the precocious Kennedy upstart to fail, and had known from the start through secret FBI reports that Bobby had wanted to replace him. Hoover had been far too powerful to push aside. He had collected damaging information on John Kennedy since the 1940s. In Hoover, Bobby had met an adversary who could not be intimidated, who would not hesitate to undermine him and his brother.
You have wiretaps that are going on in the United States, and unless the federal government can prove that the information from those wiretaps is divulged to others, we have a very difficult time in prosecution. The result is that there are these wiretaps taking place of which we can do nothing. This law, this legislation that we have suggested and recommended, will now give authority to the Department of Justice, investigative agencies of the federal government, to take action where wiretaps exist.
Bob and Hoover agreed on one thing: the importance of wiretapping in taking down organized crime. Bob, however, wanted to make any decision on wiretaps the responsibility of the Ministry of Justice, that is to say, his own. The decision had quickly prompted a violent backlash. By voting Kennedy, the mob had banked on having bought themselves a measure of tranquility. Hoffa made it clear that certain limits had better not be overstepped.
You leave indiscriminate wiretapping take place, leave it to the imagination of an attorney general like Bobby Kennedy, and you will find that we will have phones tapped in this country by the hundreds of thousands for no reason whatsoever except a personal desire to destroy those who may oppose him.
Mr. Hoffa, are you accusing the Attorney General of rigging these hearings?
I say that he's deliberately created the hearing for the purpose of trying to get through legislation of wiretapping that he has failed to do for the last 2 years.
Thank you, sir.
All things considered, Hoffa was right. And it was not just Hoffa who, within months of Bobby's arrival in Washington, became determined to get even with the Kennedys. Hoover had in his possession a letter from the mob saying that his official boss, Bobby, would not be missed. The letter had cited Bobby's Gestapo methods as Attorney General. There had been signs that others linked to the underworld would not go down without a fight. Meanwhile, in the White House, the brothers had faced their first serious crisis. Judith Campbell was John's lover, but also that of Chicago mobster Sam Giancana. On March 22, 1962, at 12:15 precisely, Hoover came uninvited to the White House to remind the Kennedys that he held their future in his hands. 2 hours later, Bobby rushed to his brother's side. The president sleeping with the same woman as a man whom his brother had vowed to destroy? Bobby had told the president to ditch Campbell. Kennedy had ended the affair with a phone call, but not his reckless womanizing. The next morning, he had left Washington for Palm Springs, and for a new woman. An FBI file suggests that Bobby may have joined them in Palm Springs, as well as occasionally at the Carlisle Hotel in New York. Whether in his personal or public life, Bob had been no saint. As a boy, he had learned that Kennedy men always proved their masculinity through courage, risk-taking, and the conquest of women. But it had not been Hoover or Hoffa or his brother's darker sexual instincts which had created the greatest crisis and shown him at his worst, but also at his best. It had been Bobby's dealings with Cuba, just a short flight from the USA. In the early years of his career, Bob had been part of Senator McCarthy's virulent anti-communist campaign. In his mind, Bobby had made Fidel Castro and his Soviet ally Nikita Khrushchev into gigantic enemies. His desire to destroy Castro had soon become a mania, when at the Bay of Pigs in 1961, hundreds of US-backed invaders of Cuba were killed or captured. This operation had originally been ordered by Eisenhower. Its total failure, however, had been blamed on Kennedy. For Bobby, it had been a crushing humiliation. He had seen his brother in tears. That night, he had sworn to get even. Now, Bobby vowed he would get Castro his own way, a way that was in keeping with the Kennedy instincts for concealment and subterfuge. Bobby had considered any means. He had turned a blind eye to the CIA plotting with the mafia in order to get rid of Castro. In fact, he had even gone so far as to support the plans by the Secret Service to have Castro assassinated. Bobby's vendetta had quickly backfired. Castro had soon turned to the Russians for nuclear protection. On the 15th of October 1962, US spy planes had revealed that the Soviets were basing secret missiles in Cuba. Faced with the greatest test of his presidency, John F. Kennedy now needed his brother more than ever. He was the only advisor he could trust absolutely. He immediately called for Bobby to come to the White House. A different side to Bobby had begun to emerge. The rational diplomat who believed in negotiation and persuasion rather than combat. Going against the advice of the military, Bob had urged his brother to try to strike a secret deal rather than invade and bomb Cuba. Bobby and his brother had taken the world to the brink and had managed to survive.
Now, I think that of all the president's advisors, Robert Kennedy brought more wisdom to that table than any other. He had the whole perspective in mind constantly. And I think that Robert Kennedy deserves more credit than any other of President Kennedy's advisors for the fact that we're here alive today.
Black Americans were being attacked by police dogs, beaten to death by the forces of order. Blacks, it seemed, had not yet been freed. In the South, they had been segregated and had filled with increasing rage. Race riots and civil rights demonstrations had spread across the nation, tainting the Kennedy image. When Americans had demanded, would it end?
Night of hesitation, frustration, filibuster has been so awfully long. Oh God, we humbly ask, how much longer? How long? 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 How long, oh God?
Bobby did not back away from this challenge. He went to meet the demonstrators, pledging to improve matters.
We say that a great deal more can be done. We say that we're going to do more, but we've got to consider where we started at. We want your help and assistance. Anybody that knows anyone, or any of you who are interested in working in the Department of Justice, you're welcome in the Department of Justice.
The Kennedys had been forced to act before the civil rights question became another paralyzing crisis.
If you haven't finished high school, it's very difficult in the next few years to get a job. But if you've finished high school and then you continue to make an effort, you can get a job.
In September 1962, a black student, James Meredith, had tried to enter an all-white college in Alabama in the Deep South. Racists such as Alabama Governor George Wallace had been determined to stop him. What side had the Kennedys been on? The white Southern Democrats who bitterly opposed integration and whose votes had put Kennedy in the White House? Or the poor, the blacks, and the violently oppressed? Bobby had urged the president to declare his position before the nation. Although he was afraid he would enrage Southern whites, John had agreed.
I don't think you can get by now without having an address on television, at least during this period of time, giving some direction and having it in the hands of the president.
And when Americans are sent to Vietnam or West Berlin, we do not ask for whites only. It ought to be possible, in short, for every American to enjoy the privileges of being American without regard to his race or his color.
In 1963, Martin Luther King, leader of Black America's campaign for civil rights, had brought his message and hundreds of thousands of followers to Washington in the biggest rally ever held there. Bob respected King's crusade, but had reservations about his private life ever since authorizing Hoover to have King's phone tapped. 5 years later, President Johnson would use this episode to discredit Bob with the black community. Not long after, President Kennedy had left Washington for Dallas. Bobby would never see his brother again. Time had suddenly run out. real progress on civil rights would be made by another president. November 1963, the end of the dream. For Bobby, the tragedy was twofold. He had lost his brother, but also the power to change America. Bobby feared that his brother would now be remembered around the world as a well-intentioned martyr, and his presidency for its crises and final tragedy, not for its significant advances. And now Lyndon B. Johnson, whom Bobby had grown to despise, had replaced his brother in the Kennedy White House. For Bobby, it felt as if he was watching a coup d'etat. For months, Bobby grieved, barely able to function. He had become his brother's ghost, a reminder of what had been lost. Gone was the forceful presence at cabinet meetings. Surely it was Bobby, not Johnson, who was the rightful heir to the Kennedy throne. Johnson was a brilliant usurper. He quickly succeeded where the Kennedys had failed.
This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice.
The Great Society, a series of bold social programs, and the 1964 Civil Rights Act more than delivered on the Kennedys' vague promises. Now it seemed Bobby was merely an envious spectator. As he slowly emerged from his mourning, Bobby began to grope towards a new mission. One day he vowed the Kennedys would take back their rightful place, but that meant somehow replacing President Lyndon B. Johnson. Bobby escaped from grief to Poland. On the streets, he realized he was at his most appealing, an incarnation of his brother. He returned to America confident that he could win power in his own right. He would run for the Senate in New York. Johnson would run for a second presidential mandate. It would not be an easy fight.
So I come to you to ask for your help and assistance, just as President Kennedy asked for your help and which you gave so generously to him in 1960. President Kennedy campaigned here, stood on these steps, spoke about the problems that were facing this state, spoke about the problems that were facing this country, and that was what was of such great concern to him and great concern to the Democratic Party and really such great concern to the American people, that we hadn't lived up to our potential, that we hadn't faced our problem. I run as a candidate on the Democratic ticket on the basis of the record that has been made over the last 3.5 years by the Democratic administration under President Kennedy.
With impeccable timing, Hoover provided damaging accusations about Bobby's relationship with Marilyn Monroe. Bobby refused to respond to the dirty trick. Johnson was not so easily dealt with. Was there a way for Crown Prince and usurper to work together to win election in 1964? At the 1964 convention in Atlantic City, Johnson insisted that Bobby speak last, lest he steal the show.
And now it is my privilege and honor to introduce the man who stood closer to him in times of crisis than anyone else, his brother, Robert Kennedy.
The convention was swept with emotion. America was already nostalgic for the Kennedy presidency. and Bobby personified the tragedy of promise unfulfilled. He received a thundering ovation, far louder than for Johnson. He was back on the campaign trail, but this time not to elect his brother. He, Bobby Kennedy, was now running for office. But what exactly did he stand for? Who was he now? He did not yet know. So he played it safe, keeping close to his brother's persona, even imitating his gestures. But Bobby was not John. He often looked nervous, stiff, and still consumed by remorse. Then suddenly, at the University of Columbia in New York, a new Bobby Kennedy took form. Compassionate, radical, yet still tough.
Former Attorney General of the United States and candidate for the United States Senate from New York, Robert F. Kennedy.
I thought maybe that you'd have some questions and we could just proceed, and you want to try to do that?
Could you tell us why you chose to run from New York?
Just how extensive is your moral commitment to civil rights? Could you please elaborate on other specific issues? What specifically would you do? Many of us have been wondering whether or not you were going to ever issue a concise statement. Do you have an answer to this accusation? Mr. Kennedy. Would you be willing to offer a statement now? You mentioned the question of housing.
I understand the state's problems today.
Well, I've been involved in this struggle now for 3.5 years. The great problem, I would think, in the state of New York now is to make sure that people of different races and colors can live together. Well, we did something dealing with organized crime, the Civil Rights Bill. The effort that was made in Harlem dealing with young people were set up by me. I think this was important. I think this was a direction. This wasn't just going out and making a speech about the matter. As I say, even beyond that, it's a question of survival, bringing new industry into the state of New York, making sure there are enough jobs, or the question of employment, the question of housing. These matters were matters in which I was intimately involved in. I was directly involved in. I was involved in the consultation and the drawing up of the legislation.
The Kennedy strong point had always been a good sense of marketing. Bob's performance had been so good it was used in campaign adverts. But by October, the campaign was losing ground among middle-class voters. Johnson came to his aid, needing to win the vital state of New York.
His knowledge in fighting crime, his knowledge in education, his knowledge in bringing peace to the world, fighting liberal, representing New York in the United States Senate, Bob Kennedy.
In the ghetto, though, Bobby did not need his help. In an age that saw the first televised campaigns, he became a political pin-up, a true star, the object of intense, almost crazed adulation. It was Bobby who dared Americans to dream of things that had never been.
In the next 40 years, what do we want for the United States? What do you want to do in the field of housing? What do we want to do in the field of education to provide enough space for building the schools as well as the building of homes and apartments? I think that if all of us make the kind of effort that's required, then I think we're going to make a difference in this country. And I think what can guide us, really, all of us, in the years ahead, is what George Bernard Shaw once said, that some people see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not? Thank you very much.
Johnson won the 1964 race with a powerful mandate for change. Unlike his predecessor, it was the greatest victory in modern times. Bobby also won office, largely because of nostalgia for his brother. His role in shaping America's future would continue. And so would his enemies' attempts to destroy him. Particularly Jimmy Hoffa.
He wasn't a good attorney general. In all probability, a worse senator. I would hate to think what would happen if he became president of the United States. you'd probably have a fascist government. First of all, to promote his own personal ambitions. Secondly, because he is a spoiled brat who believed that everybody must kowtow to him and allow him to dictate the policy. When we rejected him dictating policy of the Teamsters International Union, he took it as a personal affront, made it his business to try and destroy this international union.
And Bob had more to lose than ever. Another son, Max, his 8th child. Another Kennedy to watch over. Now that John was gone, Bobby was also the head of the entire Kennedy clan.
I'm sitting here thinking about the poems I used to write when I was just a little boy.
There were, of course, Ethel and his own children, but also Jackie and John and Caroline, the children of his dead brother.
And I gotta get the world off of my back.
In fact, he was now the one who personified the hopes of the Kennedys. One day, he would truly change America. But if he was to regain the White House, he would need to become a national and international figure once more.
Don't drop it, David, I'll kill you!
Good work, boy.
Bobby needed to feel and to touch a problem before he could fully understand. So he began to travel, ever curious to see with his own eyes the key issues of his time. Wherever he went, he appealed to a new generation to join him in fighting the evils of poverty, hunger, and war.
The free society rests on the belief that the state exists for the benefit of man, and that man is not a mere tool of the state. But I am not ashamed to say that we in America, we call to the young men and women of all nations of the world to join with us in a concerted attack on the evils which have so long beset mankind. Poverty, illness, illiteracy, intolerance, oppression, and war. These are the central enemies of our age, and I say to you that these enemies will be overcome.
But it was in America that radical change was well overdue. The American ghetto was still burning in Los Angeles, in Detroit, all across the nation. Some cities resembled war zones, endless blocks lying in smoldering ruins, soldiers patrolling to maintain increasingly fragile order. Bobby's journey continued, now to Mississippi and its horrors of abject poverty. What he saw shocked him to the core.
Did you have lunch?
We had lunch, yeah.
You haven't had lunch yet?
No.
Senator, what do you make of the problem of poverty in this, our poorest state?
We spend $75 billion on armaments, weapons. That you would think that we spend almost $3 billion each year on dogs in the United States as American citizens, that we could be doing more for those who are poor, and particularly for our children.
Now Bobby understood.
I've been to the Delta area in Mississippi, and I've seen here in the same country our same people starving to death. I've seen them in eastern Kentucky without enough food, with milk once a month for children. Well, we know that there's something wrong. We know that there's something unacceptable, and we know that we can do something about it.
Bobby's journey changed him. He had discovered his deepest convictions. He would fight now for a just society in America, a better society for his children to grow up in. He would no longer simply protect and promote the Kennedy interest. It was Vietnam, though, that was to become the turning point in his political destiny. Back in 1962, Bobby had supported his brother's intervention in Vietnam, but he did not advocate conventional war. Vietnam would be a testing ground for counterinsurgency. By 1965, though, Johnson was president and waging a full-scale war. Bobby was deeply troubled, but he could not speak out. Vietnam was, after all, his brother's legacy.
The determination of all Americans will be redoubled by this outrage. It is a solemn responsibility to have to order even limited military action by forces whose overall strength is as vast and as awesome as those of the United States of America.
Meanwhile, the draft sucked tens of thousands of working class and black Americans into the quagmire. And Johnson stepped up the war, ordering massive aerial strikes on North Vietnam. Bobby disagreed with Johnson's tactics. Carpet-bombing civilians would never bring the communists to the peace table.
My own position is concerned, I'm opposed to resuming the bombing at the moment until I have information that indicates that such resumption is necessary or is in our national interest.
1967. Vietnam was no longer John Kennedy's bitter legacy, it was Johnson's tragedy. Bobby flew to France to discuss peace proposals with President de Gaulle.
Without any question, France and General de Gaulle are going to play an important role in any successful effort that we may have in finding a peaceful solution to the struggle in Vietnam. And if that's not recognized by the spokesman in Washington, then we are in a greater difficulty than I had thought. Thank you very much.
Back in America, President Johnson was enraged. He believed the war could still be won. On Bobby's return, Johnson summoned him to the White House. "I'll destroy you and every one of your Dove friends in 6 months," he threatened. "You'll be dead politically."
At his press conference last week, the president indicated that people who criticized his plans for Vietnam weren't in full possession of the facts.
I don't know. You'll have to ask him.
Well, do you feel that you're in full possession of the facts?
I think he's the best one to ask, really.
Do you feel there is any way that the president could take steps to abbreviate your political career, sir?
I don't think he's probably interested in that.
Senator, do you
Thank
feel
you.
Bobby was now politically isolated, but determined to defy Johnson and his allies. And Johnson wasn't the only threat. Old enemies hovered, hungry for revenge. It was revealed that Bobby had ordered wiretaps on Martin Luther King and many others. It was Hoffa, of all people, who pointed the finger.
Well, Jimmy said you were in possession of a tape that would be very damaging to Bobby Kennedy.
Both criminally and from the standpoint of his image that he would like to build, that he is in favor of civil rights, but actually he destroys all the rights, not just civil rights, but all the rights of individuals who dare object to what he does.
I take it this was a secret recording that you were able to get.
I believe it's one that he never thought would become public. Let's put it that way.
Bobby's reputation as a civil rights advocate lay in tatters. But he survived the scandal and now began a new fight to end Johnson's war. Johnson's policies in Vietnam were increasingly unpopular. Bobby's views were shared by more and more Americans.
In 1961 and in 1962, as well as 1966 and 1967, we have been told that the tide is turning. We can soon bring our troops home. Victory is near. Once in 1962, I participated in such a prediction myself. But for 20 years, we have been wrong. The history of conflict among nations does not record another such lengthy and consistent chronicle of error as we have shown in Vietnam.
As casualties soared and protesters took to the streets, Johnson's popularity plummeted. California, 10th of March 1968. Bobby visited Cesar Chavez, the famous strike leader of immigrant farm workers. Bobby was inspired. If he could mobilize Chavez's supporters and tens of millions of other poor Americans, how much more he could achieve. Finally, he could challenge Johnson.
We come out here to honor Cesar Chavez. You come here as members of his union to honor him as your leader. I come here as American citizens to honor him for what he's done, not just for you, not just for this state, but for all of the United States of America.
On the 13th of March 1968, Bobby announced his candidacy to be the next president of the United States.
I'm announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policy. I run because I am convinced that this country is on a perilous course, and because I have such strong feelings about what must be done, and I feel that I'm obliged to do all that I can. I run to seek new policies to end the bloodshed in Vietnam and in our cities. I run to seek policies to close the gaps that now exist between black and white. The report of the Riot Commission has been largely ignored. I run for the presidency because I want to stand for hope between rich and poor. I run because I am convinced about what must be done between young and old. I run for the presidency because I want the Democratic Party to stand for hope instead of despair, for reconciliation of men instead of the growing risk of world war. I run because it is now unmistakably clear that we can change these disastrous, divisive policies only by changing the men who are now making them.
Surely it was an impossible dream. He had no party backing him, and another Democrat, anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy, was winning widespread support. It was a chaotic and disorganized effort. But on the streets, among the people, and watched by tens of millions on television, Bobby was once again electrifying. But the question remained, could his popularity in the streets translate into votes? He faced a tough series of back-to-back primaries, and then a very difficult convention in Chicago later that summer, if he got that far. To much of the middle class watching him on television, he seemed like a reckless rabble-rouser as he drew ever more frenzied crowds.
I ask for your help. I need your support. We can return government to the people. We can change this nation around. We can change our relationship to the Atlantic community. We can make a new effort for peace in Vietnam. I ask for your help. I ask for your hand, and I ask for your assistance over the period of the next 2 months. Will you give it to me?
Wherever he went, he tapped into genuinely deep yearnings for the mythical romance and innocence of the Kennedy presidency, but also for he. Then all the bets were off. Johnson, ever more unpopular and racked by guilt over Vietnam, announced that he would not run for re-election. Now Bobby stood a chance. He was no longer running as a Democrat against a Democratic president. The race was wide open. More and more Americans agreed with him. In the burnt-out ghettos, in the shacks of the Deep South, among the young and the radical, and in many working-class white communities, Bobby's popularity soared. United behind Robert Kennedy, perhaps they could revive the American dream. And then tragedy struck again.
I have a dream that one day we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together.
Bobby was flying to the Indianapolis ghetto to make a speech when he learned the news. His audience did not yet know.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have some very sad news for all of you and people who love peace all over the world. Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. What we need in the United States is not division, is not hatred, is not violence, but as Martin Luther King did, is love and wisdom and a feeling of justice toward those who still suffer, whether they be white or whether they be black.
In the gathering darkness, Bobby now appeared to black Americans and many others as their only hope. He was an idol, to some a messiah. His worshippers felt his pain, wanted to share his optimism, to believe he was their savior. That April and May, in city after city, the dispossessed of all colors and faiths voted for him in huge numbers. At last, the White House was in sight.
The destiny of this generation of Americans, to change the face of this nation, to deal with our problems, to talk about our divisions with candor and truth, to talk about what separates us and what divides us and what's good about the United States and what we can do about it. That's what I ask of you, to make your voices heard, not just in protest, not just being against, but that this country will have a new face. George Bernard Shaw once said, "Some people see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not?" And I ask you to join me.
On the night of King's death, Bobby had confided in an aide, "That could have been me." He told others that summer that he was doomed. Somewhere in some crowd, another killer lurked with his finger on a trigger. But Bobby did not show fear and did not ask for protection. But he won.
And I intend to make that my basis for running and over the period of the next year. So, my thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
He had not run this time as John's inheritor, but as his own man, a Kennedy who would truly change America. He told his aides he was finally Bobby Kennedy and not his brother's ghost. Then suddenly, as he was about to leave the celebration, a mentally unstable drifter, Sirhan, fired at the man who people hoped would be the next president of the United States. The senator's final words were to his wife, "Is everybody else all right?" Then he lost consciousness. Robert Kennedy died 2 days later. He was just 42.
As he said many times, in many parts of this nation, to those he touched and who sought to touch him. Some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not.
Once again, America was in mourning. More than 100,000 people of every age, religion, color, and class filed past his coffin as he lay in state in New York. In death, he had truly united America. Then began his last journey to a grave beside his brothers. As one black mourner's sign read, "We have lost our last hope." His dreams would never come true.